Hi, this is Derek Murphy. This is the fourth week of my Novel Writing Basics online course, and I'm really excited about this topic because I think it's probably the most important thing. Last week we talked about plotting out what happens in your story because that's also important to have a strong structure. But just having that structure is not going to be enough. The other crucial aspect of quality fiction is the conflict and suspense and intrigue and tension. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between those four things, what they actually mean, and some different strategies you can use to make sure that you have them in your story. I really like this picture that I chose as the background because the conflict is this big wooden mallet. You can see it coming down. So this is conflict. If you just smashed the eggs, that would be the conflict. But the suspense is that it hasn't happened yet. You see the egg and you see the mallet kind of hovering over here. So you know that there is some conflict between this mallet and the egg because this looks ominous. It could be dangerous. It's a threat. It looks like it's threatening the egg. So there's already conflict there, but it hasn't happened yet. It's unresolved conflict, and that's why you get the suspense. If you started asking questions like, why is this happening? What is happening? What does the mallet have to have against the egg? How did the egg get in this position? That's the intrigue. The questions that people ask about the conflict, that's the intrigue. Why is this happening? What's going to happen next? And the tension is a little harder to define as different from suspense, but I think it's basically longer. So suspense is, you know something's about to happen, but you don't really know how much conflict is going on. With tension, you're aware of the conflict. You probably have more information and it lasts longer. So it's unresolved conflict that kind of broods and grows over time. So if you only have two things in your story, the story is what happens. That's the plotting stuff that we focused on so much before because it is really important to know what happens. But you also have to know why it matters. Why should readers care about what's going on? And that's the drama. So this video is all about the drama. And like I mentioned in a previous video, drama is the conflict, suspense, and intrigue. I said on every page, doesn't really have to be on every page, but in every scene, absolutely. So the drama makes the story matter both to characters and readers. Readers will only be invested in characters that they like, so you have to make them sympathetic first. But once they like the characters, if they're worried about what's going to happen to those characters, it has to be something that impacts the characters. When you're talking about things that don't have drama, when it's just story and there's no drama, it means that your story doesn't actually impact the characters or the readers on an emotional level. This is actually a really big problem that I see in a lot of first novels, even famous or successful novels, but mostly from amateur or self-published books. And they either do two things. They either throw in way too much information because they think the readers need to know what's going on without a lot of conflict, or they throw the opposite in. They have a lot of conflict or a lot of violence, but we don't know why any of it matters or who the characters are, so we don't know how this conflict is relevant to the story. So often when I'm editing books, I will say you need more conflict in your scenes, and some people say things like, what do you mean I have all these fight scenes and all of this warfare and epic battles or arguments? But conflict is not just the same as violence. Specifically with real conflict, it's risk and uncertainty. So there are dangers present, but we don't know how it's going to play out. We don't know what's going to happen next. So for example, if you start off with a fight scene and your hero wins by killing or beating up a whole bunch of people, they may look, powerful or epic, but they weren't in any real risk. If the characters weren't afraid, if this was just easy for them, then that's not real conflict. And if they weren't worried about what's going to happen to them, will they survive this fight, then the danger wasn't real, the risk wasn't real. So that's why you could have a lot of actual violence without really any drama. And also, you could throw in a whole bunch of backstory or information that isn't going to matter to readers because they don't care about the characters yet. There isn't any risk or uncertainty yet, so there is no suspense or intrigue, because intrigue and suspense are caused by unresolved answers about unresolved conflict. And so this is not something you necessarily can do in the first few chapters. You don't want to be giving out too much information. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And while there should be a bunch of conflict, it should be low stakes, low risk conflict in the beginning, because you're probably focused more on world building or sympathizing with the main character. And like I said, I think in the last video, in the first 15% or 25% of the book, you want to be focused on what is even happening, and then you can shift to who is behind this, and not until closer to the end of the book would you move into the actual why, the reveals about the antagonist's motivations or the protagonist's motivations, a little bit more backstory later on once you've really shown the stakes and the conflict. So the main goal of this topic of suspense and drama in general is to get readers to keep reading, because if they don't have questions about what happens next, they're not going to be interested in progressing with the story. But to have them asking questions, you need to hold back from giving them all the answers. So while you do need some things happening in every scene, which should also have some conflict, there's always something new, something changing to further the plot along, you also don't want all the conflict to just come out. Tension is about holding the conflict back. So you show the danger, you show the risks, and it grows over time. Probably a long time before the danger, you mention it, but they try to avoid it. Or maybe it's like, you know, they heard fighting on the distance in the landscape, or they know that this is a penalty that some people have faced, but they never imagined that they would have to face it. So you kind of like present the risks inherent in the world, even if they're not clear and present dangers. But if you set them up early, you know that's a possibility. Also, sometimes it can be difficult to have believable conflict. For example, if you have two friends arguing or fighting with each other, or parents or something, it can seem melodramatic if they just start arguing or yelling for no reason. But if you build up the frustration slowly over a long period of time, and then you show the protagonist going through some, you know, a very, very stressful day, or they have a lot of other things going on, then all that built up tension can overflow into real conflict. So tension's kind of about slowly revealing more information that makes readers more and more aware of what the risks and dangers could be and where the story might be going, without actually letting the conflict, the main conflict, play out. And intrigue is kind of similar. You want them asking questions, which means you don't give them all the information. You have to show them characters that they care about and reveal the danger. So you have to put the characters in challenging situations, and they do need enough information to know why this matters, why the characters are motivated to do this thing, or why, to a small extent, why this thing is happening. Although in the first few chapters, I would just have the thing happen and put the explanation after. And the biggest challenge, like I said, that I've seen with a lot of new writers is that in the first chapter, they think they have to introduce everything. So there's like one sentence of story, of current story that's actually happening, and then a paragraph of explanation about who this person is or how they know each other or where they came from. And so it's rather than one actual scene, you're going back into flashbacks or memories or history or other kinds of information. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to make readers ask the question before you give the answer. So don't just tell them right away, what they need to know to get on with the story. Make them care about what's happening first, but hold back the information. So with intrigue, you withhold the relevant information until they want to know what's happening, why did he do that, what's going to happen next. And suspense is by showing the danger. So you show a hint of the violence or the risk or the conflict that maybe it isn't here right now, but is definitely in the story or on the horizon. But the trick with information is to reveal it in the right time. So you should reveal, and by information, there are going to be twists or surprises, which are great to have if you can have them. And you can actually make a plot twist or surprise pretty easily just by figuring out what all the important backstory stuff is, and then just don't tell readers those things. Whatever's the most important thing, that's going to be your twist or your reveal later. So make it clear, figure out like how it has to happen or what the solutions are or what the answers are, but don't tell the characters until they're looking for that information. Resist as long as possible, but eventually when the characters learn the information, readers should learn that information at the same time. So ways this can fall flat is if you tell the readers somehow without letting the characters know, and then later the characters find out the same information, and the character is surprised, like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, but it's not dramatic because readers already knew the thing, so that surprise feels kind of fake or unearned. If there's lots of information and you're not sure which information is crucial backstory, then this sentence down here, if it's important to your story, which equals it has emotional relevance to your characters and may influence their actions and reactions. So you may have tons of backstory or information that's actually not crucial to the main story. The point of information should be that, one, it's a surprise or reveal that you can withhold, which creates intrigue and suspense. But also, when the character discovers it or finds it out, it might impact their choices or their reactions, which will change the plot development. You probably don't want too much story, but a lot of this backstory you'll save towards the end of the book, maybe even like that final wrap-up chapter when someone's finally telling them, what's going on. You don't want to put all the backstory in the first couple chapters because readers won't care about the backstory until it matters to the conflict that the protagonists are involved in. And again, only if this is real conflict, which means unresolved consequences. So that's the other problem with real backstory, is it probably already happened. So the event or the action is the protagonist learning the new information. That's the change in the scene. But the actual backstory, it's not actively engaging because there is no intrigue or suspense or risk or conflict in backstory because it probably already happened. So the more important the information, the more critical or crucial for the protagonist to learn, the less easy it should be for readers to access it, but it could be or should be characters or the protagonist as well. So the more important information should be harder. It should need to be earned. So you don't want it to just come out, by luck because they talked to somebody with no conflict. They should kind of have to fight for that information. And you may have to create barriers to present that information from coming out. So let me talk about some examples of how this could go wrong, especially in your first couple chapters. These are red flags that when readers are reading your first couple chapters, they may give up too quickly, or they'll get lost, or they might feel bored, or they're just not really sure how this is relevant. So this first one is POV jumping, or point of view. I think in the next video, once we start talking more about actually writing the book, we'll talk some more about who is telling this story and who the speaker is, the narrator is. But something that people are often tempted to do is switch back and forth between different speakers or protagonists. And the challenge is it's already difficult to try to figure out how to make readers care about what's happening to one character by showing the sympathy and the conflict, the unresolved conflict, to make them wonder what happens next. So if you try to introduce a lot of different characters at once who each have their own stories, you're basically trying to tell multiple stories at the same time. It can also get confusing with timing. I know some people, maybe you tell one version of events and then you go back and repeat the same time period from a different point of view, but that's conflict that's already been resolved because readers have already been through that story one time. So even though you're revealing more information from a new point of view, it won't be engaging because we don't have the suspense and intrigue because we already know what happened. When readers start reading a story, they're on shaky ground. It's a little bit like being in an earthquake. So all they're trying to do is figure out basically what's going on. Who are these people? What do they want? What's happening? Why does it matter? So if you're trying to build a really big story and switching back and forth between new scenes or new protagonists or new characters, readers may not want to continue finding out who all these people are because they haven't been given any certainty yet about, what's the main story? How is this related to what I was reading before? Is this going to come back together? It can work, but it's difficult to structure that kind of a story where it's going back and forth between different events or times or places. One common example is that sometimes you show a little bit of what the antagonist is doing to show that there is some conflict or danger on the horizon before you get into your, hero's or origin story about like what's going on. So the other big red flag is backstory, which, like I mentioned, is challenging because a lot of authors try to put it in the first couple chapters because they think it's important to explain. But if it already happened, it doesn't really matter because there's no stakes, there's no real conflict. I don't love this choice of words, actually. Backstory can matter a lot given the right conflict. And I'll talk in a minute about when to use backstory well or when you should use it, when to introduce it, because it can be very effective and you probably do want it to deepen your story, but you probably don't want a lot of it in the first few chapters. And then finally, what I'm calling a bait and switch, but is actually kind of a few different things. So to hook them, but then change topics and expect them to still care. So for example, like I mentioned with the POV jumping, where you get started with a great scene and characters, but then you jump to totally different characters or a different scene, and they don't care anymore. Like you built this work to get them to care about what was going on, and then you made them start over with something new and unfamiliar. So that's a little bit of a bait and switch. Also, the more at stake, the more frustration readers are going to feel. So if you develop this story and you don't resolve it, and you leave readers wondering, what's actually going on with those other characters that we left behind, especially if you move into really slow scenes where there isn't a lot of conflict or development and readers are wondering, why should I care about what's happening when you're not telling me about those other things that we started with? A common way of screwing this up is dreams or flashbacks, because if it's a dream, then the stakes or the violence, the intrigue doesn't really matter. So something that can really turn off readers if your entire first chapter is a dream. So there's a really exciting, big, epic scene that's amazing and cool and interesting. There's a lot of conflict, and then they turn the page and it says, and then she woke up and then she started her day. So that whole sequence was kind of a lie. Like, it didn't really happen. It wasn't real. Dreams can actually work well if used in moderation, and usually later on in the story, possibly to show a memory or to show the character's state of mind. It can also be a way of introducing some really cool scenes into your book that wouldn't be there normally. But the dangers of having a lot of dreams or also a lot of memories or flashbacks. A flashback is just when you share something that happened in the past kind of as a scene. So even if you add a lot of conflict or suspense or intrigue or violence or whatever, doesn't really matter, because all it's really doing is presenting some new information which gives us greater context about how the characters might be feeling or how they might react. But the conflict isn't real conflict because it's already played out, so it's not unresolved. And so the other thing is the main story, which is going to be the largest conflict. So what can happen is you start a story and you mention, there are aliens or zombies, or there's a cure to a disease, or whatever is like the really big, important, large issue stuff that has a wide impact. But then in the course of the novel, you kind of forget about that main story. It never comes back up again. So you introduce all this cool stuff that never really gets used or never seems that important to your main characters. And maybe your main characters are mostly doing a character development arc, so the story is really about smaller things. But if you introduce, cool big things, your readers are going to want that to come around and to matter. If you stray too far, sometimes like you think you're building up this giant world, so you need to show all of the character development. They go to school every day, they learn how to wield the sword for months at a time. It's important, but that's not the actual story. The big, how the character impacts or interacts with the actual largest conflict is the real story. And maybe the largest conflict doesn't really come out until the third book of your trilogy, but you still need to keep circling back and at least let readers know that, you haven't forgotten about it, or the characters haven't forgotten about it. The other thing I notice, which I didn't label as a red flag, but it probably could be, is when your characters just sit down and talk to each other. That'll really kill intrigue and suspense quickly, because you create intrigue and suspense by removing or withholding information. And if two characters are allowed to just sit and talk about things, they will play all their cards and all the conflict will be resolved. So you have to try to interrupt all your characters. And this could be little arguments, or even if it's nothing, but you just withhold information, it can become suspense or intrigue because somebody is acting weird and we don't know why they're acting weird. So you raise questions by showing things that are a little bit off, or noticing things about the world that are unusual and asking what's going on. It may not actually be a really big deal, but you can create intrigue just by noticing that there's something weird happening. So you want to try to get them not to discuss what's on their mind, not to ask their questions, because if they just ask the questions that they want and they're told the answers, that would be kind of be the end of it. You want to have them ask the questions, or have them think about the questions but not ask them for whatever reason, or they get interrupted, or they get off topic and start arguing about something else. Also, if they have time to make small talk about trivial events that didn't have an emotional impact on them, it means your plot is too slow or the stakes are too low. Your characters should need or want something much more pressing then getting to know each other or reviewing things that happened earlier. Unless it's part of a discussion that helps them make a choice on how to respond to events. But these choices, the really critical moral choices, the challenging, painful choices, they shouldn't be happening soon anyway. They should be happening way later in your book. The smaller choices at the beginning of the book should be a lot easier because they won't really need the whole backstory or the character motivation. It'll kind of be a lot simpler, practical discussion of, what should we do next in response to this thing that happened. So that's something to watch out for if you ever have a scene where your characters are just sitting around and talking to each other. That's something where you probably need to cut most of it, or a lot of other things need to happen to interrupt. Dialogue is a great way of giving out backstory information. It can be used to, the point of backstory, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is really to deepen the emotional connection with characters before something bad happens. So it has its place, and it can also be just two characters talking and giving each other information, but it should be emotional and it should happen later after a lot of the questions have been raised. So the real story is unresolved conflict that will have an emotional impact on your characters and may influence their choices that will develop the plot. The resolution hasn't happened yet, so the danger is real. So this is also really important in terms of timing. If you are jumping different times or doing a lot of flashbacks or going, future, past tense, when you're jumping around, some of those scenes will have already happened. You want to try to stay. We'll talk also about present versus past tense, because you can write in the past tense, which means even though it's happened, you're telling the story as if it's in development. So at the time, the characters didn't know what was going to happen next, so readers are viewing the story and learning about things at the same time as the characters are. So the danger is real because the resolution hasn't happened yet. So the backstory is concluded action that has no teeth. There's no real danger, so there's no real suspense or intrigue. The results are known, but this could be a crucial reveal. The conflict is in the reaction. So you could have a backstory scene where you're presenting readers with more insight into the characters or the world so that they have more information and know what's going on. Just keep in mind, it's probably not going to be as engaging until it impacts the actual protagonist. So if the backstory impacts the protagonist's choices on an emotional level so that it leads to changes in the real story, then it's okay. But even so, there are places where you can use it, and you want to hold it off as long as possible to develop the intrigue and the suspense. So first, you can do it after a risky or dangerous scene. So you start with the conflict first, you show the stakes, you show some cool things happening. Then afterwards, when they're out of danger, you could show a little bit more of the backstory, where they're talking to each other or they're telling things or information. And that's basically to balance between the slow scenes and the fast scenes. You don't want it to just be all fast-paced or all slow. And especially, this may happen after really risky or traumatic scenes. Again, it can't just be conflict or violence. They have to feel like they were at risk. They are actually risking significant danger and losing something that they care about, that's important to them. So you can develop the scene to show how they feel after that threatening environment. If the stakes weren't really high, if it wasn't very threatening, or they didn't feel scared, then they're not going to sit around and think about things, think about their history or their past or these deep memories, but in very challenging, when facing very challenging obstacles or barriers, then afterwards they may feel, especially if they've lost someone or someone that they care about was at risk, then they may feel a little bit traumatized, or guilty or afraid or whatever. So there's more chance that they will be thinking about those things. They may also have questions. So they didn't have the questions before the thing happened, but after the thing happened, now they have questions that they're going to voice out loud, and they're probably going to get some information. Maybe someone tells them a story, or they pick up, like they go out seeking answers, so they Google it, or they go to a library, they find a book. You want to make the information they're after a little hard to get, so you can have conflict just in the process of them trying to get the answers, which is my point number 2, with some action or a scene. So they could be sneaking into the library to find that book in the forbidden section. And again, while they could just ask somebody the questions, you don't want to give the information too soon or too easily. So they may have reasons not to ask those questions because they don't trust the person, or they don't think they would answer, or they're having an argument about something else. So maybe they decide to, go through their journal or break into their room, or something with more conflict than just talking to each other. Because if there's no conflict, they would just talk to each other, and then the intrigue would be gone. You also want to add more backstory. Once you've raised all the story questions, so pretty deep into the book, before something really bad happens, then you would deepen the emotional attachment. So for example, if you're going to kill off a character, which I wouldn't do in a first book, probably in book 2 or book 3, but if something bad is going to happen, you have to worsen the pain, the emotional pain, by deepening the attachment. So the character might feel a deep attachment because of all of these things that have happened in their past, but readers won't know that. So you have to find a way to show them those things so that readers understand how important this is and how traumatic this will be to the character. And so you can do that with a backstory about, this one incident in their childhood with their parents or siblings or neighbor. You have to show why the stuff matters to the characters so that there's more at stake, which will influence their motivations. It'll make their motivations more believable, how far they're willing to go to, or what they're willing to risk in order to achieve their goal and overcome the obstacles. Which is number 4, justify character motivations. So your novel could be kind of flat if the character just keeps pursuing a goal, even if it doesn't make any sense. If they're, risking their life for something, we have to understand why that something means so much for them that they're putting themselves in this much danger. Or if they're risking somebody else's life, why that someone else means so much to them that they're willing to risk that person's life. Or if they're, somewhere in between the both, maybe their friend got kidnapped and they're going to go rescue their friend and put their own life in danger. You have to really show some scenes of how that friendship got started and how much they mean to each other, but you don't want to show it too early. You don't want to start with just a scene of them being nice to each other when they were kids, because on its own, that scene won't have any emotional impact. That scene doesn't matter at the beginning. It only matters later when the conflicts are real and the characters are risking everything. Then when you show that scene about it deepens the character motivation, it deepens the emotional attachment, but only because we already know how much they're willing to risk. So down here I also put 3 X's. This is how to know if it's backstory, or how to identify, especially in the first few chapters, if this is backstory that you need to cut. This is known as an info dump, when you're basically just dumping a lot of information that isn't relevant yet to the story, or readers don't know how it's relevant or why it matters or why they should care. And backstory is really important to give out at the right time in the right format. But these are some ways that people do it wrong. And you can ask yourself, who is giving this information right now and why? Why are your characters giving this information right now? They could be just thinking out loud to themselves for no reason. That's a problem, so that's something you should watch out for. If they already know this information, they're not going to remark on the thing. It's kind of similar with description. If they are in some familiar place, they're not going to be noticing all of these little details about their circumstances because they see it. So they're not just going to look at it and notice it. They might interact with it, and that's one way you can build scene description, but they won't just be sitting around, looking and noticing. Likewise, they won't just be sitting around thinking about their past for no reason, unless something happened that is making them reflect about those things. If they already know the backstory, if this is history or culture about how the world works or the normal rules of your status quo world, it will be natural to them. So they're not going to think about it. They're not going to remark about it, which means if they are doing this, then really they're just speaking out loud for the reader's benefits, which is just the narrator or the author forcing his characters to talk to readers directly or indirectly to reveal this stuff that is relevant. And that's pretty similar with telling something, they should be telling someone who already knows. So if you have two characters and they both know this world, but they're just talking out loud to each other about things. And this could be done well in a limited fashion as part of dialogue, but not just, like if they both know the details, the people, the events, they won't just be offering superfluous information to each other out loud for no reason. And it can be kind of obvious when that's happening just to give information to the readers, and it feels unnatural because the characters wouldn't do that. It can work really well later when you have probably the protagonist go to the new world and she doesn't know what's happening, and then somebody else can tell her things. But at the beginning, in the status quo world, when everybody already knows each other, they probably won't be talking out loud about things that they already know. Or if they are, it has to be around new information or events. So somebody could say, like, are you going to the party tonight? I heard that Tina was going to be there. And then, they can mention a few things that reveal a little bit of backstory about who Tina is or how it's related without going too much or overboard. Just presenting a little bit of information, because these two, like, it came about because one character raised the new information of there's a party tonight, are you going to go? So that's new information and a choice. And it's okay in dialogue because that's something that they would naturally be talking about without it feeling forced. And the third one that's a little more obvious is the narrator is just talking to readers while the characters stand still. So if you ask who is giving this information right now and it's not one of your characters, that means it's just the narrator info dumping on the page. They're just putting in a lot of backstory and the characters are just standing there while the narrator is telling readers about the backstory. So that's a red flag. That's something I would try to avoid. If you have to do it, it can be done in maybe a sentence or two, but be really careful about, your character says one thing and then the narrator writes 3 paragraphs, or the author writes 3 paragraphs telling readers about extra background information. It breaks up the scene. It's a little bit like you have a movie camera and you want your movie camera to stay in the present as much as possible, in the actual main story, versus a vignette or like a Polaroid, which would just be a picture about something that happened before, which is kind of cool and gives some background context, but isn't really relevant for the current story. So you want your novel to be more like a movie people can watch and less like a photo album where someone is showing you and telling you, you know, 100 little stories about each of these individual photographs or flashbacks while also splicing those between the main movie. If you try to watch a movie like that, it would be really disorienting. So I know I spent a lot of time on all of that backstory stuff. Um, I only pointed out because I think the sooner you learn not to do that, the faster your novel will improve. But also, I will also say that generally in the first draft, you just have to get everything down anyway. So if you have a lot of backstory or info dumps in the first draft, in the first 2 chapters, I wouldn't worry about that yet. I would put down the information. First, you have to figure out what happens. So the first draft is all about what actually happens, and that's why we focused a lot on plotting. What tends to happen next is after you write the first draft and you figure out what happens, then in the second draft, when you're revising and editing it, then you're going to figure out how to deepen the character motivation. So you know what happens, but maybe you don't, it doesn't really make sense for your characters to act the way that they did. You can still keep the what happens, the plot events, but you have to go back and fix the character motivation. That's really what you do with backstory. So I wanted to tell you about all of this stuff because it'll be useful going forward. But also when we're writing the first draft, we'll kind of keep it in the background because it'll become important again once we get to the editing stage. Once the first draft is done, we're going to focus on what happens, getting the words on the page. Then when we're editing and looking at, you know, why do my characters do these things? I need to fix the motivation. So you solve the problems with character motivation by figuring out the backstory. And then the backstory can be edited in. And often the backstory is really only a few paragraphs or pages. Like probably towards the very end of the book, you would finally be doing all the reveals or revealing more information. Otherwise, almost every backstory or twist or reveal would just be like one new piece of information, one big twist or piece of information. So I do recommend thinking about what your backstory is and figuring it out. Although don't worry too much about your huge world building or, you know, what your characters were doing when they were 13 and they went to summer camp. You need to think of a few powerful instances that show off your characters interacting with the world, that kind of reveal some of their character. But it really doesn't have to be that extensive, and we can figure a lot of it out later in the editing phases after we've written the first draft. At the same time, it's also really important to have conflict in your scene, in every scene. So I have found 3 different types of conflict that I think you can add to every scene. And the main one is outer conflict, which is challenges or obstacles that prevent the character from achieving goals. So first you would have to have, you know, something that the character wants, and then something that is a barrier that prevents them from getting the thing that they want. And so the really easy way to develop your plot is just to always make it impossible for your character to get what they want. You're basically, I've heard it said you want to put your characters in a tree and then throw rocks at them. But what you're really doing is you're forcing them to move further up in the tree. And they're climbing out into these thinner and thinner branches. So you're always presenting these new obstacles or challenges. You force them, maybe in the beginning when they started off, you know, they were climbing these big sturdy branches. This seemed like it was a good decision. They had proper character motivation. But the further you go, into the smaller and smaller branches, the riskier it gets, because now they're much higher and the branches won't really support them. So it gets more and more dangerous, and then you have to continue adding more motivation to show how they've gotten there. But this is a really easy way to add kind of like side quests to your book. So let's say they want to answer a question and steal a book out of the forbidden library, but first they've got to sneak out of their dorm room, but then they get stopped by a teacher and sent to detention, and then they have to find the key to open the library door, and then they have to drive to the library, but first the car runs out of gas, so they have to go and get more gas down from the gas station, but they don't have any money, or someone steals their wallet. And when they finally get to the library, they find that the book is missing anyway. It's easier if in your world building there's different kinds of conflict, or, zombies or monsters or something they can interact with, but it doesn't have to be the case. There could be a jealous coworker, there could be an absent father, maybe a teacher is picking on them, maybe a bully at school. A really easy way to add conflict is just to implement rules. So maybe they're a freshman and it's illegal for freshmen to get into that part of the library, so their student identity card doesn't allow them access, so they have to sneak in. So if it was just a book and the book was easy to get, they could just go read the book and then they would answer their question quickly. You want to delay that by adding in as much conflict as possible, as long as possible. Another easy thing to do is something like an information quest that turns into a favor quest. So they want information from somebody, but that somebody doesn't want to help them, or maybe they need help, maybe they need information. There's somebody else responsible for that next goal they're trying to achieve. That person can just refuse to help them, but they can send them on another adventure. They can say, well, someone stole my pigs. I need you to go and get my pigs back, and then I'll give you the map to the magical sword, or whatever. Basically, like, there's no point in them going out to save these pigs or find these pigs. It's kind of a ridiculous quest, although it can be a unique way to show, when you have like a side quest, it's a great chance to show off a scene that would otherwise be irrelevant. So maybe, like, you don't want your whole book taking place in the same location. So if there's a really cool scene that there's no real point to being there, except, and like if she was just to go and round up these pigs, it might seem like a really low stakes, unengaging scene. But if it can show a little more of the world. You can introduce a few more characters. It could add a little bit of conflict. She might accidentally discover some interesting piece of information on that side quest. Even though that seems incidental, it becomes necessary because you've placed a barrier or an obstacle where, someone else has something she needs and he wants something in return. So he's going to send her to steal something, or to round up his pigs, or to, do something that's he doesn't have time for, or he doesn't have the ability to do. This could be a little bit of a moral obstacle if he's asking her to do something that, is a little bit difficult. And that leads us also into number 2, which is inner conflict. So if you only have outer conflict, your story can feel a little bit flat. You also need some inner conflict, which would be moral struggles, decisions, guilt, shame, anger. So basically, how is the main character feeling about this conflict or these obstacles? And these should be negative feelings. If they are all good feelings, if the characters are all just this is cool, this is fun, I'm happy. That's not strong drama. You can have some happy scenes, usually right before something really bad happens. So you can have some fun, light games or whatever scenes that are just for fun, but then things should go really bad. So you set things up so that right when they are happy or fulfilled or they think things are okay, you're elevating their mood so that you can kind of create a bigger transition into really terrible feelings once the bad things happen. You don't want them to just be feeling terrible all the time. And the greater the outer conflict, or the more pressing the outer conflict, the less they will think about their feelings. So you don't want to have like too much sitting around thinking about what they should do all the time over every decision. There should be a lot of things that they just have to react to. But these outer conflicts should create internal emotional struggles, which can be moral decisions as well. Maybe not everything has to be a moral decision, but some of things should be difficult decisions where they have to make bad choices. Going back to my tree metaphor, they probably wouldn't decide to just climb the entire tree and go out on those outer tree branches and risk that much because it's dangerous, but they don't realize all the danger they're getting themselves into. They're going branch by branch, they make all these little choices, and they end up in a place they never really expected. And I was also going to say, once you've got them up in that tree, then you strike the tree with lightning, or then you light the tree on fire. So it's not enough to just add all of these conflicts. You have to put them in a really precarious balance of their own making that they are in a way responsible for, so that they can feel some guilt and shame, regret, remorse. And also because the conflict matters to them on a deep emotional level. You're showing by all these little outer conflicts that they've gone through this journey, that they are so invested in the outcome that they can't retreat, they can't go back, they can't give up. And then rather than letting them succeed, then you burn the tree down. Because stories are about character growth. Not always, not 100%, not in every genre, but to some extent, the stories worth telling are the ones where characters go through some development because it mattered to them, because it was hard enough, it was challenging enough that they couldn't succeed being who they were. They had to grow stronger. So if they just climbed up the tree and climbed down again, that wouldn't really be a story. But when they climb up the tree and they get stuck and the tree is on fire, now they are forced to really dramatic extremes. So then finally, a third point of conflict is friendly fire, which is kind of like betrayal. This is a strong disagreements between allies or supporting characters. So you don't necessarily just have to have outer conflict. So for example, the outer conflict is probably things that are happening. After things happen, they may have some regroup scenes where they are not immediately threatened. And like I said earlier, if they're in a really stressful situation and they're just trying to survive, they're not going to be thinking about their inner conflict. They're not going to have time to think about things. And as a side note, in the same sense, that's also not the time to build in descriptions or a lot of backstory. Characters will notice their surroundings when they are somewhere new, or when they're looking around, or when they're searching for something. They will notice less details if they are immediately threatened with a pressing goal. So in a high stakes situation with a lot of danger, they're probably just going to be focused on the immediate goal without much else going on. But in those slower in between scenes, after some real action happens, you might have a scene where, they're not being threatened by the antagonist forces or by external obstacles. So this is a time when they can think about things, but it would be boring if there's no conflict. So even in those scenes, you want some of this friendly fire, which just means conflict between their team. So their best friend, their relationship, their boss, their parents, anybody who's an ally. Maybe they're on the same side, but there can still be conflict. So there can be disagreements about how they want to respond or what they think they should do. There can be disagreements about different characters want different things that might be at cross purposes, or maybe it's not possible to satisfy all the supporting characters. And this is also just really important in dialogue. So rather than when you have dialogue where characters agree with each other, that's generally weak writing. And there's a way to do it, but even if they're agreeing with each other, they can kind of be joking or snarky or sarcastic when it's just, that's totally right. I absolutely agree with you. That's usually a sign where one character is kind of giving a speech or a soliloquy or a rant where they just, talk for paragraphs about some stuff. And it's probably the author's own viewpoint or opinion kind of getting in the way. And then all the other characters just say, oh yeah, that's absolutely right. So you can present information, but anything that's the opposite of conflict kind of weakens the suspense and the intrigue, because conflict is, or unresolved conflict is the intrigue and the suspense, which is the drama, which again, the point of a book, the story is what happens, it's what holds it together, but the drama is why it matters and why readers should care about what's happening. So it's really important to try to focus on as much conflict as possible, which is why I think you should have conflict, 3 different kinds of conflict if you can, in every scene. And so finally, I've got a checklist. It's a scene checklist. These are a bunch of things that I think you need to have in every scene. So basically, I try to have 2 scenes in every chapter. That's going to depend on you and on the genre and on your writing style. But basically, a scene is when something happens. And this is going to be a change or a reveal. So it's action, something happens, or it's new information. And in every scene, you're basically just writing to the point where something happens, where there's a change or a reveal. And then you should stop the scene. That should be the end of the scene. So what a lot of writers do is they write the scene, but they put the thing that happened somewhere in the middle, and then they immediately respond to it. So there's, the huge, shocking new information or revelation, something that should really matter, but then the characters just ignore it, or they just respond, or there's not really a big emotional reaction. So you need to point out to readers when it's the big thing or reveal by kind of planting a signpost, and you do that with a scene break, which just means you stop talking. You say the thing that happens, probably like in one sentence or a short sentence, because that's the big change. Then you stop. That's the break. It's a chapter break or a scene break, and then you start again afterwards with the reaction. And this is when the whole scene might be, the characters are going through the woods, and then suddenly someone attacks them, and then you stop. You don't say who attacks them or describe the fighting or anything. You stop when the thing happens. This allows readers to notice when something important is happening, and it also keeps up the suspense and the intrigue. It keeps them turning pages with they're like mini cliffhangers. Every scene probably also needs a motivation. What do the characters need or want, and why? They don't need to fulfill this motivation, and most of the time they should not fulfill the motivation. So maybe they just need a reasonable excuse for you to get the characters to go where you need them to be for the things to happen. They might be completely distracted, they might get off course, they could be kidnapped, anything else could happen to them, but they need reasonable motivation to get to where you need them to go. The most pressing thing replaces the big thing. So you may have like an overall story that your characters are trying to achieve some big goal. Maybe, for example, Dorothy is in Oz. She's trying to find the Wizard of Oz, so she's trying to find the Emerald City. But all these things keep happening to her. She gets attacked by flying monkeys. She gets attacked by a witch. She finds the lion or the scarecrow. So there's all these little scenes that keep happening. And even though her main goal is unfulfilled, the small thing is pressing enough for her to momentarily abandon the big thing and focus on the pressing thing for now until the pressing thing is resolved. But then she'll keep going back. Like once she's fixed the interaction or the interruption, then she'll keep going back to the yellow brick road and she'll continue with the main quest. So your challenge is like you have one straight yellow road. How do you keep blocking the forward movement? Because if she just walked down the road and found the wizard, it'd be a much shorter story without as much emotional depth. So something else I've heard I think is really cool is that you need side quests to show that the world is worth saving. It's been a while since I've read Wizard of Oz, so I might have some of this wrong, but basically when she started out, all she wants is to go home. She could just go find the wizard and go home, and that would be the end of it, but it'd be a much shorter story, and she wouldn't show as much character growth because she was really just in it for herself. But because of all of the side quests, she finds all of this information, she meets all these characters, she is more invested in the world, so that when she finally faces the wizard, not only is she not asking for help, but she's powerful enough to stand up to him when he refuses to help her. So not only does she just fulfill her wish, but she demands justice for everybody in the world. And after all of that, she also, like by becoming the person who can challenge the wizard, she also realizes, or he tells her, that she's had what she needed in herself all the time, but it was in that journey that those attributes, that she grew into the character that she needed, or to tap into those attributes. Anyway, what's stopping them? So the character needs something that they need or want. They need the opposition, or the 3 hurdles and obstacles. I kind of talked about this with down here, the 3 different kinds of conflict is what we talked about. I think there should be 3 kinds of conflict in every scene. This one is just opposition. So 3 specifically hurdles or obstacles, that would be the external conflict. And there doesn't have to be 3 in every scene, but just whenever you give them one thing that they want to do, try to think of 3 other things that they have to do before that are going to stop them from making progress. So for every branch, maybe to, for Harry Potter to defeat Voldemort, he has to collect the 7 Horcruxes, but for every single Horcrux, there are half a dozen different little obstacles they have to go through or figure out to solve that one problem. A main scene is going to have a reaction, a synthesis, or an action. I actually rewrote that a little bit because it was kind of confusing, so I've changed it to reaction, new plan, and event. And the order seems a little weird because in the first chapter, there won't be anything to react to. you'll be building your ordinary world, but eventually something will happen. By the end of chapter 1, probably something will happen. So like I said, when something happens, then you stop. So this is a better order where the end of a scene or the end of a chapter is the event, the new information, something happens, break, and then you start the next scene with their reaction, which could be like running away or getting to safety. It could be fighting off the hordes of orcs. So it's a response to the event. And then they have to regroup and they have to make a new plan. Probably like whatever they were trying to get, something happened and they couldn't get it. Like I mentioned earlier, they finally break into the library to get that book, and then the book is missing. So now they have to come up with an entirely new plan to find the book, or they have to give up on the book and try something else instead. So they'll have a new plan, and that will take them in a new direction, and they'll be faced with another obstacle or roadblock or hurdle, or something else will happen that's unexpected. So this is kind of like the structure that you want when you're mapping out your scenes. Try not to do too many things at once. Don't have too much information or too many things happening. Try to keep things simple. So we did mention the 3 kinds of conflict. I say here, light the fuse, 2 irresolvable opposites that create friction. So friction is the same as tension. So you can have conflict that doesn't actually erupt into physical violence. You can just be showing that the conflict exists and that your characters don't agree, or that this will be a problem eventually. And you can be building tension by slowly adding in more and more information, which is kind of like pulling the string of a bow. So you put the arrow in the bow. The bow is a dangerous weapon. The arrow is the, sharp, deadly instrument, but it doesn't have any power on its own unless it's aimed in a direction and you let go of the string. So the further you pull back the string, the more it's going to impact damage. So you want to add as much tension as possible without relieving the tension by adding in more potential sources of conflict or friction before it ever actually comes out. And really, you're going to be pulling the string the whole novel until the Dark Night of the Soul or the final battle scenes, where all of that built up tension and conflict will finally boil over into surface conflict. The snapshot is something I talked about in the plot dot, but I think that you should have a picture in mind, not of your whole scene. It might be like moving around. There might be different actions or discussions or events. But if you can think of like if you were going to immortalize this scene in a painting, what would that look like? It'd be this, depending on what's the important thing or change. Whoops, I went back. So what would that one scene look like? You don't have to draw it, but you might want to just have it in mind. The description is something that really is going to come into play when we edit. I add a lot of my description into the later editing after the main first draft is done. The first draft is just what actually happens in what order. But you do want to be thinking a little bit about how to make this scene look more visually compelling. Because, the plot stuff, it could happen anywhere. You want to make sure you're building scenes that are interesting and reveal character depth, or scenes that have inherent conflict in the world, so there are obstacles present in the landscape. Every scene should have some momentum or urgency. Why does this have to happen now? It doesn't have to be a ticking clock or anything. But if there is some kind of time limit, that's great because you're adding urgency. So maybe, for example, going back again to our library scene, we have to go to the library before it closes, or it's closed on weekends, or I've only got the car until midnight, and then my parents will be at home and they'll notice that we've taken it. Or I stole the car keys, I have to get back before Dad wakes up. So however you can add there's conflict, there's more conflict if you can add some momentum and urgency into the scene as much as possible. Why does this have to happen now? What happens if it doesn't happen now? Why do they have to hurry? See if you can invent reasons to add that in. And then finally, relevancy is kind of the same as fulfilling the promise of the premise. Relevancy is, does this matter to the real story or quest? And like I pointed out, they're probably going to be interrupted by a lot of small pressing obstacles or conflict that might not really be important. Like if they get attacked by a wild bear, for example, the wild bear is not part of the real main story. It's present in the world. In one of my books I'm talking about, she snuck out of the safe place to go find some crucial information that she needs. So she took a risk because, it's dangerous outside. It's a dystopian wasteland. And she fights a wild bear. And that conflict is not important. But because she fights the wild bear, they end up shooting a gun, which is really dangerous in this landscape because you have to be kind of really quiet. If you shoot off a gun, then the vampires will find you. Basically, I'm writing a vampire dystopia. So the bear is not the conflict or the scene or what she wanted. She went after crucial information. She came across an obstacle that forced her to respond with a gun to preserve her own life or someone she cared about. And then the actual vampires catch up with her, and they've now found the safe haven where thousands of people live in hiding, and she is now responsible for destroying the safe place for a whole bunch of people. So there's always going to be a little bit of balance between what's happening right now and does this matter to the real story or quest. The main point is that you can't get too far off the real story or the quest. If you have a whole bunch of scenes and you're getting further and further off track, does this have to happen for the character to make significant progress on the real story? If it's a pressing obstacle, if there's immediate danger, then they may have to deal with it. But if it's not immediate danger, they will shift back to the main story or conflict or quest. So it's something important to ask, just because you might have a whole bunch of scenes where it's not related to the story or quest. And like I mentioned earlier, if you lose track of why people are reading this story, and they're wondering about the big world events, you may have to build it up slowly. Your character might not be ready to challenge those big world events yet, but they should be. The smaller challenges they come up against should eventually force them into the larger conflicts. So next week we're actually going to start writing our first rough draft. And our goal will be putting down a lot of words quickly, but it will go faster if you know what happens and why it matters. So we already focused on the what happens part with all the plotting, but this video is really important for the why it matters or why it's interesting. We have done the story, but you probably don't have the drama. So as homework, hopefully you have some idea of what happens in all of your chapters. I want you to think about these conflicts. You can try to add more outer conflict, inner conflict, or friendly fire, just to make sure you have some conflict in your scenes. Because if you have scenes that don't have conflict, then they won't really be interesting to read. And you can also try to figure out what's the crucial information, and maybe make a list of, like, these are the really big information that my characters don't know yet that I want to be surprising reveal later, so that you can withhold that information as long as possible. And if you want to also do a little bit deeper work and go through this scene checklist, I'll put up these slides somewhere in the course so that you can read through it. So this is something, I mean, this is a lot of work to go through it for every scene. And there are very successful writers who don't do this stuff, and they don't do all of the plotting that we did earlier. But the difference is they definitely have a lot of drama, which is conflict, suspense, and intrigue. So they might have a lot of conflict between characters that seems really natural, or conflict in the world. It's possible to tell a story with a lot of conflict, suspense, and intrigue, and it can be really engaging and really fun to read, without doing all of the research or the background work. But it's also really easy to just write a novel or 50,000 words where a lot of stuff happens, but none of it really matters because you haven't built up the emotional drama. So these are the things that you should be thinking about this week. Maybe not necessarily for every scene. If you have, I think I have like 24. I have my chapters are about 3,000 words. So if you were writing a 60,000 word novel, that would be about 20 chapters. This is going to depend on the type of story that you're telling, and you want to write as many words as needed to tell the story. I wouldn't be too worried about writing too many words. You just want to make sure that all your words have conflict. But especially for the main 8 or 9 points of the plot dot, those are the major turning points. I would definitely focus on those scenes and making sure they are as strong as possible by doing kind of a fuller checklist to make sure that you fill out those scenes and make them really impactful. So that's all for this week. I hope this video is useful, and good luck on deepening the conflict and suspense in your novel.